My name is Amelia Brooks. I am 38 years old, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, and for most of my adult life, my father has insisted that none of that matters because I did not stay to inherit his empire. On the night of his 70th birthday, I walked back into the house I grew up in, a mansion drowning in chandeliers and old oil money, and I felt the same cold current run under my skin that I felt the night I left. The orchestra played a tasteful jazz standard. The crystal clinked. Dallas's most powerful people floated from circle to circle, and I stood there in my uniform, a quiet contradiction in a room that worshipped status the way soldiers worship survival. I had intended to sit, watch, and leave, shake a few hands, nod at the speeches, let my father have his evening unchallenged. But power cannot resist performance, even a cruel one. Halfway through dessert, my brother Robert leaned back in his chair, smirked, and lifted his glass toward me like a judge about to pass sentence. "A combat veteran singing? What a joke," he said, loud enough that the closest table stopped mid-sip. Heads turned, bracelets froze over wrists. My father, Richard Brooks, did not even hide his amusement. "Go on," he added, waving his fork as if conducting a personal humiliation. "Show them your voice." The room laughed the way people laugh when they believe the target is too disciplined to bleed. I could have said no. I could have let the sneer pass like every other slight in the past 2 decades. But I stood. I did not ask for a microphone. I did not ask the pianist to follow me. I did not even ask the crowd to quiet down. I simply walked to the center of the marble floor under the chandelier my father imported from Vienna, and I inhaled, clean and measured, like I was stepping off the ramp of a helicopter at dusk. My brother whispered it again, not realizing he was narrating the moment he would try to forget for the rest of his life. "A combat veteran singing? What a joke," my father chuckled. "Go on, show them your voice." I sang the first line, no accompaniment, no reverb, no place to hide. My voice rose and the air changed temperature. The waiters near the door paused mid-stride. Glass against glass became a high, accidental harmony before settling into nothing. The chandelier's crystals gave back 1,000 soft reflections, and for the first time in that house, I felt like the architecture was listening. The men my father admired learned silence in boardrooms. I learned it in valleys where echoes could get you killed. This silence was the latter, sudden, absolute, disciplined. The second line found its footing deeper in my chest, steady and precise. Breath, diaphragm, support, release. I had learned to sing the way I learned to shoot. Not for applause, but for focus, to keep someone else alive 1 more minute. Halfway through the phrase, I saw my father's posture shift. The contempt drained, not because he understood me, but because he realized the room no longer saw him. The room saw me. I let the phrase resolve and land, a clean note that did not plead for validation, and in the pocket of quiet that followed, chairs scraped. One chair in particular. A man in a dark dress uniform, older, broad-shouldered despite the years, rose from the table near the back. He brought his hand to his brow in a crisp salute that cut through the chandelier light like a blade. His eyes were wet. The sound of breath being held moved through the room like a tide. Silence, I thought, is the most honest applause. And yet what came next was louder than any ovation. He held the salute until I lowered my head. Then he spoke, voice rough, as if he had not planned to use it tonight. God, that voice! The words were not theatrical. They were an identification, a recognition, like he had been carrying a photograph in his pocket for a decade, and finally found the face to match it. Someone muttered, "Who is he?" Another answered in a whisper, "General Monroe." That name moved across the floor in small ripples. Albert Monroe. Retired now, but legend is a kind of rank that survives retirement. My father's expression tightened into something I had never seen on him before. Not fear, not guilt. A calculation gone wrong. Robert stopped smirking. He looked at me, then at Monroe, then back at me, the way a man looks at a door he did not know existed suddenly opening in a locked room. My mother's hand closed around her napkin. White linen crushed into a fist. The only visible betrayal of an emotion she had spent decades burying under etiquette and floral arrangements. The guests began to shift, unsure if they should clap, stand, or pretend they had not heard the broken voice of an old commander naming me as if naming a lost soldier. A chair leg dragged, a fork fell, the air conditioner hummed too loud in the unnatural quiet. Monroe stepped forward. He did not wait to be invited. He did not ask permission from the host. He simply moved. A man who had outlived both protocol and patience. When he reached me, he lowered his hand and said, 10 years ago, in the canyon east of Alta Kadum. I heard that voice over a failing radio. 14 men held a line because that voice told them where to place their fear. You did not sing to impress us. You sang to keep us breathing. I did not answer right away. I looked at my father. He could not hold my gaze. There are defeats you can deny in public. This was not one of them. Shame is not loud. It is a cold color that moves from the face to the shoulders to the spine until posture itself becomes a confession. I nodded to Monroe. General, I said. The word carried 2 decades of everything I owed to men who learned to stand back up when standing was the last thing their bodies wanted to do. The room exhaled, collectively, finally allowed to move now that a narrative had been issued. But none of them knew that the story they wanted to applaud had a second chapter. They thought they had just witnessed redemption wrapped in a ballad. They had no idea redemption had a ledger. There is a kind of memory that never lets you remember it in full. It arrives in fragments, like shrapnel still moving under skin. 10 years earlier, the sky was the color of iron, and the canyon walls turned our own gunfire back against us in echoes that lied about distance. The radio crackled, the batteries were dying, and fear has a pitch the human voice does not naturally sing in. I found the same pitch, on purpose, because panic spreads fastest when it believes it is alone. I remember a young private, freckles darkened by dust, counting the beats between mortar rounds as if he could bargain with time. I remember telling him to breathe in on the count of 4, out on the count of 4, to match it with my notes so his lungs had a job other than terror. I remember the smell of burned metal, and I remember 2 syllables of a name I never got to finish. Not every voice gets to finish. When General Monroe said my voice held a line, I thought of the men who held it with their bodies while mine held it with air. I thought of a boy who ran left when the map said right because the right was already gone. I thought of the way silence falls in combat, not noble, not beautiful, just honest. A subtraction that does not add up until much later when someone hands you a casualty list and a pen and asks for your signature. The guests at my father's party would never smell that canyon. They would never understand the geometry of fear, or how music can draw a perimeter around it so it quits advancing for long enough to reload discipline. I let the fragment pass, not because I wanted to protect them from it, but because I understood something in that moment that would not fully bloom until later. The voice that saved men could also indict a man who never set foot on sand. The tempo inside me slowed. The spike of adrenaline settled back onto the bar line. The general's salute still hung in the air of my mind, but another image began to form behind it. A signature, an authorization code, a company name I could not yet admit belonged to my family. I thought that night would end with applause and a private apology my father would never say out loud. I thought the room would resume its clink and chatter, the way rich rooms do when threatened by emotion. I was wrong. That first note did not close a wound. It opened a file. A week later, in a quiet office that did not belong to any of us, General Monroe slid a folder across a table. Inside were procurement schedules, shipment manifests, and a contract number circled in red. The vendor was a subsidiary. The parent company sat in a gleaming tower in downtown Dallas. Its logo matched the bronze plaque on the gates of the house where I had just sung. Brooks Defense. My father's signature was not on the cover page. Men like him do not hand their names to paper lightly. It was buried on an authorization letter, a small scrawl that said he approved a chain he never cared to follow to its end. He would say later that he did not know. Many men who profit from distance do not know, not because they are innocent, but because knowledge would require them to refuse the money. I closed the folder. The first note I sang at his party had been a reckoning. I did not realize until I touched that paper that it was also a key that turned in a lock my family built, and that I was finally ready to open. I am Amelia Brooks, Lieutenant Colonel, combat veteran, singer by necessity, daughter by blood. And that night, as the applause faded, I learned I was also the witness who would bring my father to the only stage he could not control, a courtroom where silence means something else entirely. I grew up in Dallas, inside a mansion that looked perfect from the outside, but felt hollow from the inside. My father, Richard Brooks, was the kind of man who could silence a room with a glance. He built an empire from defense contracts, real estate, and a reputation for being untouchable. My mother was softer, but she rarely raised her voice in that house. It was Robert, my older brother, who was destined to carry the Brooks name forward. From the time we could walk, it was clear which one of us was seen as the heir and which one was treated like a stubborn shadow. As a child, I found refuge in the old piano sitting in the corner of the formal living room. It was covered with dust, a decorative piece that no one cared to play. I remember pressing a single key for the first time, a trembling note that felt like my own breath taking shape. That first note became my secret language, a way of saying the things I was not allowed to speak aloud. While Robert was praised for learning the stock market at 14, I was told to sit still and look pretty for family photos. My father never understood music, and he never tried. One afternoon, when I was 12, I gathered the courage to play in front of him. I remember the melody, a simple tune I had practiced for weeks, barely rising above the sound of his phone call. When I finished, he didn't clap. He didn't even look up. He said without emotion, "You'll never be a pianist." His tone wasn't just dismissive, it was final, like a judge delivering a sentence. The words burned into me, not because I believed them, but because they showed me who he was. That night, I pressed a key again when everyone was asleep. The note rang through the dark, quiet house, soft but unbroken. I promised myself I would find my own stage, one where I didn't need his approval or his applause. I didn't know it then, but that first note was the beginning of a path that would lead me far away from the Brooks mansion and deep into the deserts of Iraq, where my voice would be heard for reasons my father could never understand. Leaving the Brooks mansion was not a dramatic rebellion. There was no shouting match, no slammed doors. I left quietly, almost invisibly, because I knew staying would suffocate me. I did not join the army to prove my father wrong. I joined because I needed a place where my worth was not tied to family wealth or expectations. I craved structure, something honest and unpolished, something that would strip me down and teach me how to stand on my own feet. Basic training was brutal. The first weeks felt like an endless series of failures. I was slower than I wanted to be, weaker than I thought I was, and every morning I questioned whether I had made the biggest mistake of my life. But with every blister, every bruised knee, and every shout from a drill sergeant, I began to understand resilience. Pain did not destroy me. It carved away the pieces of doubt I had carried since childhood. I remember one night after a grueling field exercise, I collapsed onto my bunk, too tired to even cry. A fellow recruit handed me a canteen and said, "Brooks, you've got the stubbornness of 10 people. Use it." That was the first time I realized my stubborn streak, something my father hated, was actually a strength. The army gave me scars, both visible and invisible. I failed tests, I repeated drills, and I faced days when quitting felt easier than breathing. But I stayed. Not for medals, not for recognition, but because service gave me a quiet purpose. It taught me that real strength comes from enduring, from finding calm when chaos surrounds you. And somewhere in those dusty training fields, I discovered a voice I never knew I had, the same voice that would one day hold a room full of strangers completely still. 10 years ago, I learned that fear has a sound. It is not loud or obvious. It is the ragged breathing of soldiers trying to stay alive when the world around them is exploding. We were pinned down in a narrow canyon east of Alta Kadum. The air was thick with dust and gunpowder, and every echo of gunfire bounced off the rocks, making it impossible to know where the next shot would come from. Our radios were failing, the batteries were weak, and every transmission cracked like dry leaves. Panic began to creep in, quiet but deadly. I remember looking at the faces of the men around me. Most were barely out of their 20s, some still had that unshaken look of youth, but in that moment their eyes were wide and hollow. Sergeant Evans whispered, "We need a way to hold this line." I didn't think. I just opened my mouth and sang. It wasn't a song I had rehearsed. It was something I carried from the piano keys of my childhood, a melody that once comforted me when I felt small and forgotten. The first note startled them, then it steadied them. I matched the rhythm of the song with the timing of our breaths, inhale on 4, exhale on 4, and slowly the chaos thinned. The gunfire did not stop, but our fear stopped controlling us. That moment became our shield, a fragile one, but enough to get us through until reinforcements arrived. Later, I found out that part of my voice had been captured by the radio. A low, shaky transmission carrying a melody over static. That recording somehow spread through our unit like a strange anthem. It wasn't because I sang well, it was because in that moment, the voice gave them something to hold on to when everything else was falling apart. It was during that mission that I first met Colonel Albert Monroe. He was already a man of impossible resilience, the kind of leader who could command a room with silence alone. After the canyon was secured, he came to me and said, "Brooks, whatever you did back there, it saved lives. Don't forget that voice." I nodded, but I didn't fully understand the weight of his words. Only years later, when he stood up in my father's birthday hall and saluted me, did I realize he still remembered that melody, the one note that kept us breathing when the world tried to silence us. The day I was promoted to lieutenant colonel should have been one of the proudest moments of my life. I had survived the canyon, led missions that tested every limit I had, and earned a rank that only a few ever reach. The ceremony was simple yet profound, rows of soldiers standing tall, the sound of the national anthem echoing across the base, and my commanding officer pinning the silver oak leaf on my uniform. For me, it was a moment carved out of blood, sweat, and years of relentless discipline. I sent a message to my family, not expecting much, but hoping for something, maybe a short call, maybe a word of pride. Hours later, I received a brief text from my mother. "We're proud of you. Dad is busy with a board meeting." My father didn't even type it himself. He had his assistant forward a 2-line acknowledgement, one that felt colder than silence. It read, "Congratulations, Amelia. Good for you." I knew that tone. It was the same tone he used when signing routine contracts, detached and purely procedural. I remember standing in my quarters that night, staring at the polished insignia on my uniform. I wasn't angry, I was just numb. I realized that no matter how high I climbed, in his eyes, I would never rise above the girl who left the mansion to play soldier. It was in that moment I stopped waiting for his approval. I understood that my life's worth was measured by the men and women who trusted me on the battlefield, not by a father who could barely look up from his empire long enough to see who I had become. 3 weeks after my promotion, a cream-colored envelope arrived at my base mailbox, thick, perfumed, the Brooks family crest pressed into the wax, as if legacy itself could be mailed. Inside, an invitation to my father's 70th birthday gala, black tie, RSVP required, the kind of event Dallas society calendars pretend is culture. I read it twice, not because the words mattered, but because I was measuring my pulse. It didn't spike. That told me more than the invitation ever could. I did not need his approval, and I wasn't naive enough to believe it would be waiting for me between champagne flutes and forced toasts. But I had unfinished business with the house that raised me to be silent, and the man who mistook silence for obedience. Returning wasn't about reconciliation, it was calibration. I wanted to know whether the person who walked out years ago would still shrink in those marble halls, or whether rank, scars, and the canyon had finally rebuilt my spine into something that wouldn't bend for family politics. I packed a single dress uniform and a pair of running shoes. No gowns, no jewelry, nothing that suggested I was coming home to play a part written for me before I could read. Robert texted, "See you soon, hero," with a laughing emoji that told me everything about how the evening would begin. My mother called to ask if I needed car service from the airport. I told her I'd drive myself. Independence is not a speech. It's a series of small refusals. When the plane descended over the grid of Dallas, I looked down and thought about first notes, and how sometimes the only way to know your voice changed is to sing it in the same room that once tried to drown it. The Brooks mansion was alive with its usual arrogance that evening. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across the room like polished fragments of judgment. Men in tailored suits and women in gowns, worth more than a soldier's annual pay, filled every corner. I stood near the back, my dress uniform crisp, my medals a quiet testament that none of them cared to read. Robert spotted me first. He crossed the room with a glass of scotch in hand, his smirk already rehearsed. "Well, if it isn't the family soldier," he said, his tone dripping with the same sarcasm he'd worn since we were children. "You know, people here have been talking about you. The war stories, the singing." He let that last word hang, mocking and deliberate. A combat veteran singing? What a joke. I felt the shift in the air as a few nearby guests turned, their smiles sharpened by curiosity. Robert wasn't done. He raised his glass like a gavel and added, "Go on, Amelia, show them your voice. We could use a little entertainment before the real speeches." My father, Richard, leaned back in his chair at the head table, watching the exchange with a faint, cruel amusement. He didn't stop Robert. Instead, he gestured toward the center of the room with his fork, as though presenting an exhibit. "Yes, Amelia," he said, his tone calm but commanding. "Why don't you show them what all that military training has done for your talents?" The room chuckled, a ripple of polite cruelty moving through the guests. I looked at Robert, then at my father. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I simply set my glass down, smoothed the front of my uniform, and said, "Fine." The sudden quiet that followed wasn't respect yet. It was expectation. They wanted a spectacle. I was prepared to give them something they would never forget. But not for the reasons they imagined. I stepped forward, not for them, not for my father, but for myself. Because sometimes standing still is the loudest defiance there is. As I stepped toward the center of the room, I felt every eye on me, heavy and curious. Some guests looked amused, waiting for me to trip over my own pride. Others were just bored, eager for any distraction. But one pair of eyes caught me off guard, sharp, steady, and filled with something that looked like recognition. It was Officer Albert Monroe. He was seated near the back, dressed in a dark suit that didn't hide his posture. The unmistakable stance of a man who had spent decades commanding respect. His hair had turned silver, but his gaze was still as clear as a rifle scope. When I met his eyes, I felt time fold in on itself. For just a moment, I wasn't standing in my father's ballroom. I was back in that canyon, dust stinging my throat, my voice trembling through static on a dying radio. Monroe's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. His brow lowered, his lips pressed into a line, and I saw a memory flicker behind his eyes. I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that he recognized me, not just as the daughter of Richard Brooks, but as the voice that had cut through gunfire 10 years ago. He tilted his head slightly, as though silently urging me to do what I came here to do. Robert was still laughing softly, whispering something to a guest beside him, but I barely heard it. My father leaned back, expecting a performance that would make me small again. Monroe, however, sat forward, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes never leaving mine. There was no mockery in his gaze, only quiet understanding. I drew a slow breath. In that instant, I realized this wasn't just about proving myself to the Brooks family. It was about remembering who I had become, someone who had faced fear head-on and survived. I gave Monroe the faintest nod. His jaw tightened, and I knew he understood. He had heard my voice before. Tonight, he was about to hear it again. I stood under the chandelier, its crystal prisms scattering light across the polished marble floor. My father leaned back in his chair, waiting for me to falter. He expected hesitation, maybe a nervous laugh, anything that would confirm his belief that I didn't belong in this world of powerful men and carefully choreographed perfection. Instead, I closed my eyes, inhaled, and released the first note. It wasn't loud or theatrical. It was steady, raw, and unshaken, cutting through the hum of whispered conversations and the faint clinking of glasses. For a split second, the room didn't understand what was happening. I could feel my father's eyes on me, expectant, waiting for the laughter to come. But the laughter never arrived. The note carried weight because it wasn't a performance. It was the echo of the canyon, the same tone that once held 14 soldiers together when death surrounded us. I felt the tension shift, subtle but unmistakable. Guests who had been smirking moments earlier straightened their posture. A waiter, frozen mid-step, lowered a tray without a sound. I opened my eyes just long enough to see my father's face tighten. He looked around as if searching for someone to share a smirk with, but found only stillness. Even Robert, who moments ago had taunted me, stared with his lips slightly parted, unsure if the joke had just turned on him. The silence was no longer polite, it was reverent. The melody flowed, unadorned, without the crutch of instruments. I wasn't there to impress them. I was there to remind myself that my voice could stand alone, even in a room that once made me feel invisible. As the last note lingered in the air, I lowered my hands to my sides, calm and unflinching. No applause followed. Not at first. The guests were too caught off guard, too unsure how to respond. My father shifted in his seat, his jaw tense. I could tell he wanted to reclaim control of the room, but he couldn't. Not this time. That moment, that silence, was not his to own. It belonged to me. It was the first visible crack in the wall he had built around the Brooks family image. When I looked toward the back of the room, Monroe was standing, his expression solemn, as though he had just heard a ghost. That was when I realized the silence was louder than any cheer could have been. For the first time in my life, I saw my father unsure of himself, and that alone felt like victory. The applause never came the way my father wanted it. Instead, it died into an awkward hush, broken only by the soft rustle of dresses and the clink of silverware. After a few forced laughs and a quick change of topic, I excused myself from the ballroom. I needed air, something that didn't smell of expensive perfume and old pride. The garden was quiet, lit by small lanterns hanging from the branches of ancient oaks. I stood near the stone fountain, letting the sound of running water ground me. That was when I heard footsteps, measured, deliberate. I turned and saw Officer Albert Monroe approaching. His presence carried the same gravity as it had in the ballroom, but out here, away from the audience, his eyes softened. "You haven't changed much," he said, stopping a few feet away. "Except your voice, it's stronger." I smiled faintly, unsure how to respond. "You remembered." "I could never forget that canyon," Monroe replied, his tone low. "Your singing, it kept us breathing. But that's not why I needed to talk to you tonight." He reached into his coat and pulled out a thin leather folder. "What's this?" I asked, my voice tightening. "Evidence," he said. "I've been digging for years, and I think your family's company, Brooks Defense, supplied a shipment of untracked weapons that ended up in enemy hands during that operation. I didn't want to believe it, but the documents don't lie." My breath caught. I took the folder, feeling the weight of it like it carried something toxic. Inside were contracts, shipping records, and internal memos bearing the Brooks Defense seal. My father's empire. "You're saying my father—" I stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Monroe nodded. He might not have known every detail, but his signature approved these shipments. Those weapons were used against our men, against us. I gripped the folder tighter, my heart pounding, the memory of that canyon burning in my mind. The men I had sung for, the lives we barely saved. And now, to see my own family's name linked to their suffering. It felt like a betrayal deeper than anything I had prepared for. "Why tell me this now?" I asked quietly. "Because I saw you stand up to him in there," Monroe said, his eyes locked on mine. "I need someone on the inside, someone who understands both the cost of silence and the power of truth." The fountain's water trickled between us, a soft counterpoint to the storm building inside my chest. I didn't know what to say, but I knew one thing. This was no longer just about a family's reputation. It was about justice. I left the garden with the folder tucked under my arm, my hands cold despite the humid Texas night. Monroe's words echoed in my mind like distant gunfire, soft at first, then impossible to ignore. I told myself it couldn't be true. My father was a ruthless businessman, yes, but not careless enough to arm the same enemies who had nearly killed me and my unit. Yet doubt had already set its hooks, and doubt, I've learned, demands evidence. That night, instead of returning to my hotel, I drove to a quiet cafe that stayed open past midnight. I ordered black coffee and opened the folder under the dim yellow light. Inside were copies of shipping manifests, each stamped with Brooks Defense's emblem. I ran my fingers over the paper, as if the texture alone could tell me what was real. The dates matched the operation, the destinations were blurred by coded abbreviations, but I recognized the region, Iraq, the canyon. I pulled out my laptop, logged into public defense procurement databases, and started cross-checking the contract numbers Monroe had flagged. They were there, hidden among legitimate shipments. A few clicks later, I found myself looking at internal corporate memos that had been leaked years ago and forgotten by the press. One line stood out like a bullet hole. Approved for expedited delivery, RB. RB Richard Brooks. I froze, staring at those initials, willing them to belong to someone else. But as I dug deeper, I found more. Scanned authorizations bearing my father's full signature. Notes in his assistant's handwriting referencing his approval. He could claim ignorance, but the paper trail whispered otherwise. My hands trembled, not with anger, but with the slow, suffocating weight of realization. This was no longer just business negligence. This was complicity, And if Monroe was right, those weapons had been in the hands of the men who ambushed us. The same men I had sung over to keep alive some semblance of hope. "I don't want to believe this," I muttered, my voice barely audible above the cafe's hum. But I no longer have the right to refuse the truth. It felt as though the ground beneath my life had shifted. I thought of my father sitting at the head of that long dining table, surrounded by people who would never know what real survival meant, while his name rested on documents tied to death and betrayal. The realization hardened something inside me. I closed the laptop, gathered the papers, and slipped them back into the folder. My reflection in the cafe window looked back at me, uniformed, decorated, but suddenly carrying a heavier burden than any rank could prepare me for. I knew I had to continue digging. If this was the truth, it needed to come to light, no matter what it cost me, or my family. The next morning, I drove to the Brooks corporate tower downtown. I hadn't planned it. My hands simply followed the steering wheel, as if my mind already knew where I needed to go. I walked through the glass doors and into the lobby, where Robert's face, polished and smiling, hung on the wall among the executives. He was the golden child, the one who never left, the one who understood how to play the game. Robert found me in the hallway near the elevators. "Amelia," he said, his tone sharper than usual. "What are you doing here? Dad isn't around." "I'm not here for Dad," I replied, holding the folder Monroe gave me. "I need to ask you about these documents." His smile faltered. For a second I saw something flicker across his face. Fear, maybe, or guilt. He glanced at the papers without taking them. "Where did you get these?" "From someone who believes Brooks' defense has blood on its hands," I said. "Were you involved?" Robert's jaw tightened. "Don't start with that tone. You don't know how this business works." He stepped closer, his voice lower now. "I've had to clean up messes for Dad for years. Signatures, authorizations, paperwork that couldn't be traced back. I thought I was protecting the company, protecting us." "So you knew?" I asked. My voice was calm, but I felt something break inside me. "I knew enough," he admitted. "Enough to realize that saying no would ruin everything. I didn't like it, Amelia. I'm not cold-blooded like him. I just don't know how to fight him the way you do." His honesty caught me off guard. For the first time, I saw Robert not as the arrogant brother who mocked me, but as someone trapped under the same shadow I had escaped years ago. He wasn't cruel, he was weak, too comfortable with silence, and silence, I realized, could be just as destructive as action. "Then maybe it's time someone finally fights him," I said. Robert didn't answer. He looked away as if the words were heavier than he could carry. Sometimes, memory feels like a series of photographs left out in the rain. The edges blur, the colors bleed, and you're left trying to convince yourself you still remember what truly happened. For years, I believed the story of that canyon in Iraq was straightforward. I sang I held the line, and I kept everyone alive until reinforcements came. That's what people told me. That's what I told myself. But lately, fragments have started to surface. Fragments I've ignored because they don't match the version I've carried. There was a moment somewhere between the second verse I hummed and the mortar fire, when I saw a group of civilians huddled against the canyon wall. I remember shouting for someone to cover them, but the next moments feel hazy. Did I run toward them? Did I lead them out? The memory insists I did, but a sliver of doubt tells me otherwise. There was a young soldier, barely 20, named Evan Cole. He was reckless, the kind of fearless that gets mistaken for bravery. I recall seeing him sprint toward the civilians while bullets cut through the air like steel rain. I remember him waving his hand, yelling for us to move, but then nothing. The next frame is just smoke, debris, and a ringing in my ears. We told his mother he died a hero. Maybe he did. But what if his death wasn't just the cost of war? Monroe's folder hinted at something darker, the untracked weapons that reached enemy hands. They came from a shipment tied to Brooks' defense. If that's true, then the same bullets that killed Evan might have been authorized with my father's signature. I can't let myself believe it fully, not yet. But deep down, I know that my memory of saving those civilians may not be my story to tell at all. It might be Evan's story, one I've unintentionally taken because it hurts too much to see it clearly. The deeper I dug, the heavier the evidence felt in my hands. Every document, every signed authorization pointed to the same truth. My father's company had been part of a supply chain that cost American lives. I met Monroe again the following evening, away from the eyes and ears of my family, at a quiet diner on the outskirts of Dallas. He was already seated, a manila envelope resting on the table like a loaded weapon. "We can't handle this like a family argument," Monroe said as I slid into the booth. "This isn't about personal grudges, it's about accountability. If we push this quietly through the proper channels, the Department of Defense and the FBI can trace every link in the chain." I nodded, my jaw tight. "I don't care how careful we have to be, but I'm not letting this disappear into another boardroom cover-up. We'll do it by the book." Monroe leaned forward, his voice low. "You understand what that means, don't you? Your family's name will be dragged through the mud. Your father will face criminal investigations. Your brother, he won't come out clean either." I stared at my reflection in the window. "I understand. I won't shout this across the mansion. I don't need to. The truth will speak for itself when it lands on the right desks." That night, we scanned every page of Monroe's files and my own research into a secure drive. He made the first calls to contacts he trusted in federal investigation teams. I drafted a formal report, detailing everything I had found, attaching every document that bore the Brooks defense seal. The moment I hit send, I felt a strange quiet settle over me. This was not anger anymore. It was resolve. It was the vertical spike, the choice to push my own blood into the fire of truth, not out of revenge alone, but because silence would make me complicit. The news broke on a Tuesday morning, just before sunrise. I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing relentlessly. Calls, texts, news alerts lighting up the screen. Brooks defense under federal investigation for illegal arms supply. The headline ran across every major network. By the time I turned on the television, the story had already become the top headline on CNN and CNBC. Reporters camped outside the company headquarters. Helicopters circled the downtown tower where my father's name was etched in bronze. The family's carefully maintained image of untouchable power cracked overnight. Stocks for Brooks Defense plummeted within hours, wiping out millions in market value. Longtime partners and contractors sent official letters to suspend collaboration until the investigation ended. I could almost hear the panic spreading like wildfire through every corner of the empire my father had built. My mother called first, her voice trembling. "Amelia, what's happening? They're saying terrible things about your father. The phones won't stop ringing." I listened quietly, choosing my words carefully. "Mom, the truth is coming out. It has to." There was a long pause on her end before she whispered, "Did you start this?" I didn't answer. Silence this time said more than words. Later that afternoon, Robert called me, his tone sharp and frantic. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The board is in chaos. Dad is losing it. He's threatening lawsuits, calling in favors. This will destroy us." I thought of Evan Cole, of the civilians in that canyon, of the soldiers who never returned. "Maybe it's time something destroyed the illusion," I said. By evening, the news had gone international. Every anchor spoke of corruption, negligence, and blood money. I sat alone in my apartment, the television flickering in the dark, knowing this was only the beginning. I had lit the fuse, and now the blast was shaking every foundation of the Brooks name. I found him in his office that night, surrounded by silence and the faint smell of whiskey. The room, with its leather chairs and dark wood shelves, felt smaller than I remembered. My father sat behind his desk, his posture rigid, his eyes burning with the kind of pride that refused to admit defeat. A dozen missed calls from Robert lit up my phone as I stepped inside, a folder of printed contracts clutched in my hand. He didn't look up immediately. "You're here to gloat?" he asked, his voice even but tight. "No," I said, setting the folder on his desk. "I'm here to show you what you signed." He hesitated before flipping through the pages. His face betrayed nothing, but I saw the tension in his jaw. I pointed to the section where his signature appeared, bold and undeniable. "These shipments, Dad, they weren't just numbers on a ledger. They were weapons that ended up in enemy hands. Do you understand what that means?" He closed the folder, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know the details of every deal, Amelia. I can't be expected to track every shipment. That's not how a company of this size operates." I stared at him, anger rising but my voice staying calm. "Not knowing is a choice. You built this empire by keeping your hands clean on paper while others carried out your orders. You can't claim ignorance when the blood is on your signature." He met my eyes then, his expression darkening. You always did have a self-righteous streak. I built all of this for this family, for you, and now you're tearing it down. I took a step closer. You always thought I was weak, that I'd crumble without your approval, but you're the one who can't stand on his own truth. You think power is about hiding mistakes. It's not, it's about facing them. For a moment, I saw something shift in his gaze, fear maybe, or the recognition that I no longer belonged to his world of silence and manipulation. He slammed his hand on the desk, but his voice faltered. You don't understand the weight of these decisions. I understand more than you think, I replied, my tone firm. I've carried men dying on my watch. I've seen what happens when weapons fall into the wrong hands. And now I know some of those weapons had your name on them. That's a weight you can't drink away, Dad. His face hardened, but he didn't speak again. The silence between us was heavier than any argument. For the first time, I saw him not as the invincible patriarch of the Brooks family, but as a man cornered by his own choices. I found Robert in the study the next evening. He was pacing, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, a glass of bourbon sweating in his hand. The confident, mocking brother I had known was gone. In his place stood a man fraying at the edges, trapped between loyalty and guilt. You think you've won, Amelia? He said when he saw me. His voice cracked on my name. The FBI is circling. The board is in shambles. Do you realize what you've done to this family? I closed the door behind me. What I've done? Robert, this didn't start with me. It started with Dad Steele's, and maybe with you. How much did you know? He turned away, staring at the rows of family portraits on the wall, his shoulders stiff. I knew enough, he muttered. Enough to know the contracts weren't clean. I saw the paperwork, the shipping codes. I buried some of it, made a few files disappear before they could raise questions. The admission landed like a blow, even though I had suspected it. Why? I asked, my voice sharp but steady. Because I thought I was protecting all of us, he snapped, spinning to face me. You don't get it. Dad built an empire. People like us don't survive scandal. I did it to keep the family name intact, to keep you out of it. I stepped closer, my eyes locked on his. Keeping me out of it? Robert, you buried evidence that could have saved lives. Do you know what those weapons did? Do you know who they killed? He shook his head, his expression crumbling. I didn't want to know. I told myself it was just business, that someone else would take the fall if things went bad. He paused, swallowing hard. Amelia, I'm not like Dad. I never wanted to be ruthless. I just didn't know how to say no. For a moment, I saw the boy he used to be, the one who always wanted to win my father's approval, but never knew how to fight for his own soul. His eyes glistened as he whispered, Can you forgive me? I held his gaze, my silence heavier than any answer I could give. Finally, I said, The law comes first. We'll talk after. He flinched, but nodded, as if he knew that was the only truth left between us. For years, I told the story as though I was the hero of that canyon. People repeated it back to me. Amelia Brooks, the soldier who sang to save her unit. And I never corrected them. It wasn't entirely false, but it wasn't the whole truth either. I sang, yes. I kept our breath steady, our minds from unraveling. But I wasn't the one who saved that group of civilians trapped near the canyon wall. It was Evan Cole. Evan was barely 20, the youngest in our unit, with sandy hair that curled just slightly under his helmet. He had that kind of fearless smile that makes you believe nothing bad could touch him. When the first mortar struck, he didn't flinch. When we realized civilians were caught in the crossfire, he didn't hesitate. While I sang to keep everyone calm, Evan ran straight into the open, sprinting toward the civilians while bullets cracked like whips through the dust. I remember shouting his name, my voice breaking mid-note. He turned once, gave me a nod, quick, determined, and then he was gone into the chaos. By the time I finished the song, by the time reinforcements finally arrived, Evan was lying in the sand, his body curled as though he had simply gone to sleep. The worst part came later, when we found fragments of the weapon that killed him. I didn't think much of the serial numbers back then, but Monroe did. He traced them quietly over the years. And now I know. They belonged to a shipment authorized by Brooks Defense, by my father's company, by the man who mocked my singing at his birthday party, oblivious to the fact that the same voice he ridiculed had tried to drown out the sound of weapons he profited from. I've carried that guilt for 10 years, Every medal, every salute, every word of praise felt like a lie because Evan never got the chance to stand here, to be recognized. He was the one who took the real risk, who saved those civilians. All I did was sing. My voice may have steadied the line, but Evan's sacrifice was the reason anyone survived that day. This truth is the knife that cuts deepest, not just into me, but into the illusion of the Brooks name. We weren't just negligent. We were complicit in the kind of deals that put death into the hands of children, into the hands of the men who pulled the trigger that ended Evan's life. I went to Evan's mother years ago, stood in her kitchen, and told her that her son was a hero. I didn't tell her that my family's weapons might have been the reason she buried him. Now, with Monroe's files in my hands, I know I can't keep that secret any longer. The Brooks legacy, the polished empire, the sharp suits and golden plaques, they're nothing but a hollow shell. One good push, one hard truth, and the whole structure will collapse. Tonight, I decided that I would be the one to push, not for revenge, but for Evan, for the truth. The storm didn't stop at the courthouse doors. It roared across headlines, social media, and talk shows, feeding on every fragment of my family's scandal. One side of the public called me a hero. Commentators praised my courage to stand against my own bloodline, to expose corruption that had been hiding in plain sight. They said I was the rare soldier who fought a battle not with bullets, but with truth. The other side saw me as a traitor. They flooded online forums with venom, calling me the daughter who destroyed her father and the soldier who spat on her family name. I read one comment that said, "If my child did this to me, I'd disown them forever." Another headline screamed, "Amelia Brooks, savior or snake?" The words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. Talk shows turned me into an endless debate topic. One anchor said, "She's a whistleblower, a patriot," while another shot back, "Or maybe she's just using her military image to ruin her father's empire." Opinion columns called me both brave and shameless in the same breath. It was surreal to watch strangers dissect my life like I was a character in a drama rather than a person who had bled for her country. But the truth was, I didn't care about their applause or their hate. I cared about Evan Cole's name, about the civilians who lived because he gave his life. I cared about the soldiers who deserved to know who had armed their enemies. When I walked past a group of reporters outside the courthouse, one shouted, "Amelia, how do you feel about betraying your own family?" I paused only long enough to say, "There are worse betrayals than telling the truth." The cameras flashed like gunfire, and for a moment I felt like I was back in that canyon. Except this time, I wasn't hiding. I was standing in the open, and I was ready to take whatever came my way. The first day of the hearing was like watching two worlds collide. My father sat in the defendant's chair, impeccably dressed, his tie knotted with the same precision he used to build his empire. Across the aisle sat General Albert Monroe, his uniform adorned with ribbons that represented decades of service and sacrifice. When Monroe took the stand, the room shifted. His voice was calm, but every word carried weight. He spoke of the ambush, of the weapons traced back to Brooks' defense, of the soldiers and civilians who never made it home. My father's jaw tightened as he listened. For the first time, I saw a crack in his confidence. Not because of the threat of prison or financial loss, but because Monroe's testimony was a mirror. It reflected the cost of his decisions, not in dollars, but in lives. He tried to keep his composure, but when Monroe held up a photo of Evan Cole, the young soldier who died, I saw my father look away. The courtroom was silent except for Monroe's voice. "Your company's name is on these weapons," he said, "and that name is etched in the graves of men who trusted this country to protect them." When it was my father's turn to respond, he didn't shout or deny. His voice was low. "I didn't know," he said. "I didn't want to know." That was the moment I realized fear had finally reached him. Not fear of punishment, but fear of the truth. Robert called me late one night, his voice hoarse and frayed. "I can't keep pretending," he said. "I have something you need to see." The next morning, we met in a small conference room at a law office I trusted. He arrived with a box of files, his hands trembling as he placed them on the table. "These are copies of internal memos and shipping logs," he said. "Dad ordered me to destroy them months ago. I didn't. I couldn't." I opened the box and flipped through the documents. They were damning, more contracts, more evidence tying Brooks' defense to illegal arms shipments. "Why now?" I asked. He looked at me, his eyes raw. because I can't live like this anymore. I tried to convince myself I was just following orders, keeping the family safe, but I can't watch this tear everything apart and say nothing. If giving these to the investigators shortens the fight, then I'll do it. I'll face whatever comes. For the first time in years, I saw a glimmer of the brother I once admired, the boy who had once defended me when no one else would. He was pale, scared, but resolute. "Will this fix anything?" he asked. I closed the box, nodding slowly. "It's a start." He swallowed hard. "Can you forgive me, Amelia?" I didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between us, heavy but necessary. Finally, I said, "The law first, we'll talk after." He nodded, understanding that forgiveness couldn't be given on words alone. He had to earn it, just like I had to see this through to the end. The verdict came on a quiet Friday afternoon. My father stood in court, no longer the towering figure who ruled boardrooms, but a man stripped bare by truth. He pleaded guilty to the charges of negligent arms trading and corporate fraud. It wasn't a dramatic confession, just a few steady words that signaled the end of an empire built on shadows. The sentence included heavy fines, government oversight, and the forfeiture of significant company assets. But what struck me most was what he said after the ruling. "I will not let the Brooks name stand only for profit and shame," he told the court, his voice low but unshaken. "I am allocating a major portion of my personal wealth to create the Evan Cole Foundation. This fund will support the families of fallen soldiers and sponsor music therapy programs for veterans who carry wounds no one can see." I felt something shift in the room when he said Evan's name. It wasn't redemption. Redemption doesn't come that easily. But it was the first honest act I had seen from him in decades. The press covered it as a strategic move to soften his image, but I saw it differently. This was his way of facing the cost of his choices, even if he had arrived late to the truth. As we left the courthouse, my mother squeezed my hand. "You did this," she whispered. I shook my head. "No, Mom. He chose this, finally." And for the first time in years, I felt the Brooks name carry a weight that wasn't just about shame, it carried responsibility. 2 weeks after the trial, I received a call from General Monroe. His voice carried that familiar steadiness that had once held a line of terrified soldiers together. "Amelia," he said, "I have an offer. The National Military Music Academy wants to expand its program for treating veterans with PTSD through music therapy. I recommended you as an honorary advisor." I was silent for a moment, unsure how to respond. "Me? I'm not a professional musician, General." He chuckled softly. "You don't need to be. That voice of yours, your first note, has done what no formal training can. You reminded us that music is not about perfection. It's about connection, healing." His words hit me deeper than I expected. I thought of the canyon, of how one simple melody had kept fear from swallowing us whole. I thought of Evan Cole, whose courage still echoed through every note I sang. I accepted the invitation. When I walked into the academy for the first time, I didn't feel like the soldier who had to prove her worth. I felt like someone carrying a torch lit by others who came before me. Monroe shook my hand and said, "Your first note saved lives. Now it will save even more." That day, I understood something new. Music no longer needed to be my weapon of defiance. It could be my bridge to healing, for myself and for those who carried scars that words could never touch. I visited my father in his smaller, quieter home, far from the grand mansion that once symbolized power. He looked older, not just in years, but in the way his shoulders slumped, as if truth had carved away the steel in his spine. He greeted me with a nod. No pretense of control left in him. We sat in the study, the same room where he had once told me, "You'll never be a pianist." Now his voice was softer. "Amelia," he began, "I was wrong about strength. I thought it was about control, money, the ability to command a room. But I see now, strength is about facing what you've tried to bury. It's about truth." I didn't interrupt. For years I had longed for some version of these words, but hearing them now, I realized I didn't need his approval anymore. He exhaled slowly, his hands trembling slightly. "I can't ask you to forgive me. I don't deserve that. But I want you to know, I see you now, I see what you've become." I looked at him, my expression steady. "Dad, you don't owe me praise. You owe them an apology. Evan Cole's mother, the soldiers who carried the weight of those weapons, the families who paid for our silence." He lowered his head. I will spend the rest of my life doing that. The foundation, it's just a start. For a moment, the room was quiet. But it wasn't the same silence that used to crush me as a child. This silence was lighter, like an understanding finally found its place between us. I stood to leave, but before I reached the door, I turned back. You once told me I'd never have a voice. But Dad, that first note, my note, did more than you'll ever know. It spoke for those who couldn't. He nodded, his eyes glistening. He didn't argue this time. He simply let me go, and that, perhaps, was his truest apology. Silence has a cost. I learned that the hard way. For years, I stayed quiet, thinking it was safer, easier, to let the world believe what it wanted about my family and about me. But silence doesn't erase the truth. It only buries it deeper, where it rots and grows heavier with time. A single note sung with honesty can cut through that weight. My voice was never meant to impress anyone, but that first note I sang at my father's party was the most expensive note of my life. It cost me my family's comfort, the illusion of safety, and a name I once thought I needed to protect. But in exchange, it gave me freedom. It gave me purpose. If you've been carrying a truth too heavy to bear, I hope you find your own first note. Speak it, write it, or simply whisper it to someone who needs to hear it. If this story has reached you, I ask one thing. Write down the name of someone you need to tell the truth to. Maybe that note will be the start of something that heals not just you, but everyone around you. My first note once saved soldiers on a battlefield. Now I sing for those who have never had anyone stand and salute them, not with medals, but with respect. This story isn't about revenge or pride. It's about finding the courage to create a sound that matters, even if no one applauds. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee? Or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel, not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today, wherever you are. We hope you carry this story with you, and remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. This is Amelia Brooks, and this was my note. May you find yours, and may it bring light to those who never had anyone to stand up for them.